Just like to start off with our ideas about virtual environments. And I think about virtual environments as both an opportunity and a challenge. Okay, so the idea, you've heard a little bit about immersive virtual environments already. The idea is that an observer is surrounded by a computer graphics environment, and they are tracked, their body movements are tracked so that they can interact with the space. So the opportunity is that we can use these computer-generated environments to manipulate both environment-based and body-based cues in ways that we couldn't necessarily do in the real world. But at the same time, we can maintain ecological validity in our experimental designs by allowing people to perceive and act and interact in realistic spaces. Okay, so there's lots of advantages to using virtual environments, but the challenge, I would say, is that the utility of a virtual environment for research and applications increases greatly with the likelihood that people will perceive and act in the virtual space in the same way that they act in the real world. So we call this concept perceptual fidelity. And we've been studying this in immersive virtual environments by trying to compare perception and action in the virtual environment to the real world. Okay, so the idea is if we see similar behavior, then this is a good evaluation of how effective that virtual environment is, rather than just asking people to report their subjective experiences of how much presence they feel, or how immersed they feel, or how much they like it. So we've been faced with this general application challenge. I'll give you one example that in a lot of our work, our previous work in immersive virtual environments, we found that people tend to perceive and act in virtual spaces as if they were smaller than the real space that they were supposed to represent. And this is a problem. Particularly, we saw this in egocentric distance perception, that people would underestimate the distances to targets that were in front of them, compared to controlled experiments where we looked in the real world in the same space and the same targets, we would find that people were more accurate at judging those distances. So we've argued that the perception of scale, or absolute size and distance, is really critical for a number of different types of applications that are relevant to this meeting, such as architectural design, building spaces that are perceived at the right scale, as well as using virtual environments for training or other types of educational applications. So one thing, though, that I want to point out is that as new technologies emerge, they may change the challenges. And I just want to give you one example where here as I said, we've done a lot of studies looking at distance perception in virtual environments. This is a study we did a couple years ago that compared people's judgments of distance when they were in our kind of high-end traditional head-mounted display that we used to use. You can see the one on the right. This is made by NVIS, costs like $30,000, compared to judging distances when they were in this case, it was the Oculus developer kit version a couple years ago, which costs a couple $100, right? And it's a very different system. And so we have people look at targets, and then we do a traditional distance judgment measure where we have them look at the target, close their eyes, and walk to that target. We know that people are really good at doing this in the real world, but what we found over many studies in the past, and we found this again for our old NVIS HMD, people underestimate distances by about 20%. Okay, so they're walking about 80% of the distance that they should. But then when we compared that to the Oculus DK2, we found that that distance underestimation decreased. People are actually more accurate. So now they're walking maybe 90% of the distance. And this was then replicated with a number of different modern head-mounted displays, these HMDs that we call commodity level. So the HTC Vive, you might be familiar with, or the Oculus Rift, or now there's a number of other ones. All of these that are so much more accessible, costing hundreds of dollars instead of tens of thousands of dollars, and they seem to be doing better for distance perception, or the perception of scale. Okay, so I want to use that just as a context to move on to what I really want to focus today on is another new technology that's emerging in the use in research and applications, and this is augmented reality. So the difference here from immersive virtual environments is that in AR, the observer is in their real world space. Okay, so now there's some sort of see-through device where computer graphics can be presented on a screen that a person sees, but they have the context of their actual real world environment. So you can see this come out in many different types of forms, such as using a tablet where you're looking through the tablet and you can superimpose graphics onto the real world, or these types of see-through devices. The Hololens is maybe the most well-known, made by Microsoft, in the top left corner, and this is also a picture of the new Magic Leap 1, which is another type of see-through device. So we've been most recently asking, how can augmented reality aid in navigation? And what we've started to do is to take two approaches to answering this question. One is to go back to the way that we've tried to quantify perception and action in VR, in virtual reality, but apply that to the study of AR environments. So we want to see if we can directly compare people's perception or their action-based judgments in an AR environment. How does it match to what they would do if it was completely real world? And so I'll talk about a couple methods for doing this. Specifically, I'll focus on this one of affordance judgments. So can people make judgments about their capabilities to act on these AR objects? And then second, if we can establish that people can use AR as they would use the real world, then can we use AR to provide additional cues for spatial learning when people are navigating in novel new spaces? Okay, so to talk a little bit about this method using perceived affordances, we're using affordances in the way that that Gibson first described it as these action possibilities in an environment that are directly related to an observer's capabilities. Okay, so the idea is that this is an apple, but it's also something graspable, and it's graspable if it can fit within the span of your hand. Okay, so it's what's out there in the environment, but also defined with respect to what you can do with it. And here's an example of this is a doorway, but the doorway is passable if the doorway, that aperture, is wider than the widest part of your body. Okay, so we relate the environment to people's body capabilities, and what we're trying to do with AR is then see if people can make judgments about AR environmental objects in the way that they would in the real world. So here's an example of one of my graduate students standing in our lab in the top image. And then what he's seeing through the HoloLens are those virtual poles superimposed in the real world. And they kind of look like that. They actually look even worse in the sense that you get this kind of translucent feel in AR. So, this is a reason why the HoloLens is called the HoloLens. It kind of looks like a hologram. So the graphics isn't great, but there are ways to improve them. So the question is, if we present these two poles, this aperture between the poles, can people make judgments about whether they can pass through these poles as if they were real poles? Can they scale them to their body size? And so we use this methodology where we present different intervals of the aperture, different widths on every trial, and our participant looks at the aperture and says yes or no. Could I pass through that, standing at a distance of a few meters away, without turning, without hitting their shoulders? Okay, so they're given this instructions about what to think about. They say yes or no on every trial, and then we get this crossover point, or this point at which they just say it's just barely passable, where they're saying yes to a bunch of larger intervals, and as it gets smaller, they finally say no. So we take that point, and then we form a ratio to the actual passable aperture that they can do, just by having them stand within those poles and see where their body does not touch the poles. Okay, so we get this ratio of how accurate they can judge their passing through relative to their own body size. And then we compare that to the exact same setup, but with two real poles. Okay, and so the take-home message here from this task is that people were able to judge their passing through of the virtual aperture in the same way as they could with the real world. Okay, so there's a little bit more to this, but I won't get into some of the details of the rest of the study, because I want to just move on to say that that's not always the case. So then we looked at another type of affordance judgment, and this was stepping over a gap. Okay, so in this case, a person's looking down at their feet and they see this virtual gap, or this purple space you can see there, that can change in size. Okay, so it's either longer or shorter, and they're instructed, and this is them in the real world, they're looking down, you know, they can see something that you can't, and they have to, on every trial, say, is that gap crossable? Could I step over that gap, totally clear it, get my heel on the other side with the largest step that I could take? Okay, so then after the virtual trials, then we take their actual largest step. Okay, so we can see the actual gap that they can cross. And we form a ratio again, and what you can see is that, and we do this also in the real world, with the real world gap, just made of material, presented at different intervals, and people are underestimating what they say they can do in AR compared to the real world. Okay, so what you can see kind of is it looks like they're overestimating what they can do in the real world, but that's common when we look at gap stepping in the real world. But the relative difference is what we're interested in. So then we think about, well, why is this the case? One of the things that someone already mentioned is the field of view could have a real impact in this type of task. So the field of view of the Hololens is very small. It's 17 degrees vertical and 30 degrees horizontal. So that's much, much smaller than your normal, 100-something degree real world field of view. And so what happens when you look at something really close, such as this gap on the ground, is that only a small part of the graphics fits within that field of view. So you're kind of looking down and seeing just this piece of like kind of purple space, and you have to kind of piece that together to understand the size of this gap. So it's possible that the technology here is interacting with the type of affordance judgment that we're asking, because when you look at something farther away, like that aperture, then you can think about that more would fit in that field of view of the HoloLens. So we want to think a little bit more about what the AR device can give us, and also, as we're seeing, there's new emerging technology coming out all the time. So one more question that we're starting to ask with AR that I think is also relevant to this idea of interacting with buildings is that can we convey risk in the AR graphics, right? So could we potentially put augmented reality in a space so that it would cause people to act differently? So here's a case where we present a gap, like I talked about before, but hopefully you can see that the gap on the right has also a depth, okay? And then the middle is deep at some level, and the other one is flatter. So we're trying to suggest a pit here. And our question is, if we present something that kind of appears risky, are people going to change their affordance judgments, even though this is just a virtual graphics on the ground, right? Like they know there's not really a pit there. So we've seen in virtual environments that people will adjust their gap crossing judgments when they're standing at a height. So they'll be more conservative. They'll say they can't step over as large a gap. So we wanted to see would we get the same type of result here. And in fact, I don't have the results here, but in fact, this is what it's looking like. When people have a really deep pit compared to a shallow pit, they're adjusting their affordance judgments to say that they cannot cross as large an interval. Okay, so this suggests that we could use AR to potentially influence how people make judgments about acting or act in spaces if they're able to treat AR as it is, that it's a real object or a real part of the space. So I'll just finish. I just have one more minute to talk about the work that we're then expanding to look at spatial learning and spatial navigation. So our ultimate goal is to say, can AR help in spatial learning by potentially presenting an augmented reality object as an orienting landmark, as Liz talked about a little bit, or possibly look at whether AR and real-world objects are treated similarly as targets. So let me just show you, this is kind of a, let's see if this works, rough video here. But what we have here is we've made now a real-world maze. So we've gone back kind of in technology, so we have a real-world maze, but we're presenting augmented reality objects within that maze. So you can see as Grant is navigating around, he can find an augmented reality target there, but then he can look back and see this pole as an orienting landmark. And we're trying to just kind of mock up at a small scale if people can use these types of AR objects or to help them in spatial learning, because then after he navigates in this maze, we'll ask him to indicate where these objects are that he initially learned. So we're hoping to then expand this to look at putting these AR landmarks and objects in real spaces. We have some larger buildings that we're working with, but wanted to prototype it here in our lab. So I'll just end with some conclusions that we can think about what I'm calling mediated environments as this continuum from all real world to all virtual world, and we have augmented reality somewhere in the middle, and that they have the potential to change human building interactions by providing additional cues or by providing environments where we can study the perception of scale and things like this. What we've argued that it's important to evaluate the perceptual fidelity of these mediated environments or mixed reality environments, and we can do that by studying basic performance questions, studying perception and action judgments. And then the advantage is that we see a lot of flexibility with augmented reality environments, but there's also challenges for both the accuracy of perception and also thinking about the role of attention, as has been mentioned already before. So I'll just end with acknowledgments of people that have worked on this project. This is in collaboration with our colleagues at Vanderbilt University, funded by the Office of Naval Research for the AR stuff and NSF funding for some of the VR work.
Thank you, Sarah.